archive materials to explore aspects of our listening relationship with each other and the multiverse. She is currently focused on how sound relates to the past, our histories, environment, and our collective and individual memories from a feminist perspective. Aspects of our creative practice have developed out of those interests and include composition and installation based work. She also writes and lectures on these and related subjects, as well as collaborating with choreographers, filmmakers, visual artists, and other musicians. She is a professor at Creative Research in Sound and Practice at London School of Communication, University of Barcelona.
Okay, thanks Guda, and thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks for coming, and hello. Okay, my presentation this afternoon is called Atmospheres of Love and Loss. And I want to start really by thinking about what Friedland said earlier on about this Burmese term for affective atmosphere, which I liked very much. And if I can recap, and hopefully I've got it right, you said that the Burmese term for affective atmosphere comprised of three things: feeling, the social collective, and vaporous emanation.
And the term is anui that.
Thank you. I'm not even going to try and say that. I want to sort of move on from that a little bit and actually consider atmosphere as a vibratory energy. I'm actually indebted to thinking about this, like this, to one of my PhD students, Matt Parker, who is about to submit a great thesis called Vibrating the Web, Sonospheric Studies of Media Infrastructure Ecologies. And I want to, just as a kind of slight preamble from that, talk about this concept of the sonosphere. So it was originally introduced by Pauline Oliveros in 2011 to describe what she called, and I quote, the sonic envelope of the earth created by all vibrations set in motion, which functions in alignment with Earth's resonating energy and as waves and phonons. This resonating energy is both consciously and unconsciously processed by all creatures of perception using Earth bio and technological systems. So that's Pauline Oliveros on the sonosphere. Following from Oliveros, Douglas Kahn more precisely defined the sonosphere to expand what he describes as atmospheric listening, embracing, quote, a full sweep and barrage of energies, including the magnetic, electrical, electromagnetic, geomagnetic, and quantum, as well as acoustical. And that's Douglas Kahn from 2013. The consequence of thinking sonospherically for sound artist and writer Brandon LaBelle is the recognition that, again I quote, vibration extends the environmental soundscape deeper towards the physical material plane to link the body into an expanding field of resonating energy. So what I want to try and talk about today, or rather present today, is something that is more about a vibrational energy in a specific location that I feel extends both into the past, across seas, from land to land, from people to sea to people, quivering beneath everything, connecting, and a kind of affective atmosphere that inhabits and is inhabited both materially and within people's imaginations. So, for this presentation, I haven't got any pictures, and I have got some sound, but unfortunately the cable's a little bit dodgy, so I'm going to do my best to play it. I'm rather hoping that with the sound, the vibrational energy of these sound recordings will transduce some vibrational energy back into you. And again, there'll be a kind of transference between materiality and imagination and all those sort of things. So, the location that I want to talk about is the location that features in the concert yesterday, and it's the Outer Hebrides, which are islands off the west coast of Scotland in the north of the UK. So for those that don't know, just a brief description. There are more than 200 islands in the Outer Hebrides, but only a few are now inhabited. The islands are in the far north, but their northerly point shares latitudes with North Newfoundland in Canada and southern Norway, and they run from about 130 miles from top to bottom. They're 40 miles off the coast of Scotland, so they can only be reached by boat or air, and as a result they rely heavily on ferry and planes for the movement of people and supplies. The islands have a distinct, unique social and cultural identity, which is of course both a result of both their geographical position and their relative isolation. So let me try and go with a bit of sound. So, in this presentation, I want to explore a little how the sonic atmospheres created by the specifics of geography, language, religion, and the changing history of a place both contribute to and emanate from its social and cultural identity, and how these might change over time. So my work in the Outer Hebrides didn't start with scholarly research. In fact, nothing was further from my mind. I've been visiting the Outer Hebrides for the last 3 decades or so, at first in search of a remote holiday escape from urban life and the ideal place for cycling and walking, and later as an artist making recordings and attempting to use sound both as a methodology and as a means of dissemination. I guess over time I became caught up in and affected by the atmosphere. Maybe the vibrations got to me and the vibrations became part of me, and maybe to an extent I became a very small part of them. My serious artistic research with the islands started in 2006 and consisted mainly of archival and scholarly research into photographic recordings, texts, oral history and other recorded material, interviews and field recordings. 6 of the 7 works that currently make up the Hebrides suite were released by Grin Recorder in 2013, and the 7th was made in collaboration with pupils and staff from the Gaelic class at School Linaclate, Benbecula, as well as members of the North and South US Historical Societies. And that project was supported by the local museum, who exhibited the exhibition for 3 months in 2015. Okay.
Otherwise, the song is also available at Grin Recorder.
Yes. It'd be so nice if it was available now, though. Let's just try and get it going. Oh, here we go. If I hold it like that. Oh, sorry, I can't move both hands and keep the sound going. Okay, so because of their location, the Outer Hebrides have a lot of weather. Wind of various strengths is an almost constant factor, accompanied for much of the year by rain and cold. A beautiful Hebridean day is a light breeze and a few hours of sunshine. As a result, there are days when ferries and planes cannot travel and the islands are totally cut off. The sound of wind is a constant in the consciousness of the inhabitants, and there are a huge variety of words for the specifics of weather. There are more than 200 islands in the Hebrides, but only a few are now inhabited. The most famous instance of depopulation is probably that of St Kilda, otherwise known as the island at the end of the earth. In the 2001 census, the total population of the islands was 26,000, with the population of North Uist recorded as 1,200, Benbecula 1,200, South Uist 1,200, Barra 1,000, and other smaller islands such as Eriskay, Berneray and Flodday had populations of 133, 136 and 11 respectively. While there's been an overall slow population decline in the islands over the last 200 years, peaks and troughs by the numbers of inhabitants have been associated with and caused by economic and political fluctuations. The rise of the kelp industry, that is the collection of seaweed to be burnt for the manufacture of glass and soap, saw the population double over a 100-year period. When the kelp market crashed, poverty and famine, including potato blight in the 1840s, led to whole villages being evicted by landowners, often brutally, to make way for the much higher profits of sheep farming, to meet the demand for wool, much of it used in making uniforms for the army, and mutton, and later for deer. During these forced clearances, many people took assisted passages to Canada and Australia, and later in the 19th century, as far away as Patagonia and the Falkland Islands. So even now, well into the 20th century, much of the island lands are owned by absentee landlords, and the islanders' struggle for self-determination have included community buyouts of land, and still much of some of the islands are privately owned. Oh, dear. Okay. Can we hear anything now? Oh. It's up totally. It's just not working. Okay. Well, it would take me quite a long time to transfer all my sound files.
Because it is working with other computers.
No, it's fine. It's working with my computers. It's working with everything else I played it with.
Is it playing now again?
Yeah.
We can do one thing again. If you play your computer again from your speaker.
Okay. All right. Okay, I'm sorry. You heard enough of the sound yesterday. It's just I'll try and play some bits, and my beautifully crafted sound and speaking, which I've worked on for days, it won't happen. So there you go. All right, so traditionally in some areas of northern Scotland, land was divided into small individual crofts, or areas of enclosed land as well as common land. This led to a close-knit communal life, which included, which shared the growing and harvesting of crops and the tending of livestock. including taking the cattle to graze on higher ground every summer. The crofting year revolved around shared labour, cutting peat, thatching roofs, and shearing and dipping sheep, necessary to sustain life, as well as shared social life. This system meant that people's lives and livelihood were intimately bound together. In interviews, many of my older subjects mentioned times when people would come together in places of significance to the community. And these communal gatherings were often gender-specific. For example, a number of subjects talked about women and children meeting daily for the evening milking at a specific place on the Macha, a fertile, low-lying, grassy plain found in some of the northwest coastlines of Ireland and Scotland, and in particular the Outer Hebrides. So, Isa McKillop of Berneray told me, every summer the cattle were taken down to the Macha to graze, and they had a cow herd employed for the summer. After the cows were milked in the morning, they were set out for the common grazing, and then the cow herd drove them down to the Macha, and we had to go down in the evenings. There was a cattle fold on the Macha, and I used to go there with my auntie to milk the cows, and that was the meeting place. That was where they socialised and chatted about the gossip of the village and the area, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. Other gatherings were seasonal, and many were specific to this small island area. For example, cutting the peat, which is a compressed, kind of very old, sort of like cut from moorland, and it's used for fuel and cooking when dried. Thatching roofs, shearing sheep and selling them off to auctioneers from the mainland, ploughing and walking the Tweed. I'm just going to see if I can make the walking the Tweed bit work. So Harris tweed is a famous woolen cloth that has to be woven in the islands, and traditionally the newly woven tweed is hand finished by soaking it and thumping it rhythmically to shrink and soften it, and a number of women come and to get together to do that and sing to keep the rhythm going. The coincidence of these points of remembrance suggests an individualised yet shared heritage of place and function. Each memory enshrined in sounds, often little changed over centuries. The chatter of women, the playing of children on the Macha, dominated by the cries of specific birds that make it their habitat. Summer skylarks, the lowing of cattle, maybe the distant baaing of sheep. The gentle wind moving slowly through the bent grass, a distant dog bark, or an accordion playing. Here's a recording, I'm going to try and play this, made about 10 p.m. one summer evening, which, when played to any islander, is instantly recognisable as a mix of sounds that have meaning to them. The sound of distant birthday celebrations from a sheltered beach travels across the Macha to be mixed with the distinctive sounds of the sea, wind, sheep, and the corncrake, a now rare European bird which is most common in the Outer Hebrides. The celebration starts with the singing of Happy Birthday and continues with the sound of accordion music. As one historian and cultural commentator on the Outer Hebrides has said, there are no particular features in the township which show the development from feudal bond to freehold. No village square, no village pub to act as a neutral area for local discussion, no visible memorials to the war dead, and none of the outward trappings which indicate a closely knit social community. Yet the Crofting township is a tight social unit, simply because it is the folk of the township who are the dynamic elements. The physical environment is merely a stage setting. I'd go one further than this and suggest that to an islander, the uniquely recognisable soundscapes of those activities, the sounds that form the backdrop of their lives, and to a large extent have formed the same backdrop to the lives of their parents, grandparents and the generation before them, are a vital component of memory, a historical sense of belonging and ultimately a sense of loss. Change comes slowly, but it does come. When talking to John and Mary McLean of the small island of Bernera, they told me about the coming of the causeway between North Uist and Bernera. Let's see if this will work.
There were two kings to have the causeway.
Were they?
Yeah, because they thought, well, 6 o'clock bend is, different from anywhere else.
Yeah.
But they didn't realise that everybody in Edinburgh coming across the ferry being a hostel.
Yes.
And I think they felt, well, we are still unique and we know who's on the island, but they didn't really.
So what John is saying is that people didn't want the causeway between this island and the next island because they felt that they wouldn't know who was on the island and there might be strangers there. Because when the ferry stops at 6 o'clock, nobody can get on or off the island. But he's saying that's complete rubbish. And they go on to talk about the fact that how the causeway opened life up for them totally. It meant that they could do things like go out to dinner. It meant that they could do things like go and get their letters from the post office without having to get a lengthy ferry journey. But it also meant a sense of loss, because what actually happened was that the children from the small school of that island could now go to school on the next island by bus. And so the school closed down. So the island lost the sound of children playing 3 times a day. The Outer Hebrides are the most strongly coherent Scottish Gaelic-speaking area in the world. Gaelic is a Celtic language related to Irish. It's a poetic language which often sounds like the language in which it's spoken, full of soft winds, mist and rain. Throughout the 20th century, all the parishes in the Outer Hebrides were reported to be over 75% Gaelic speaking. In 2001, 61% of the population of the Outer Hebrides still spoke Gaelic, compared with 1.2% in the whole of the rest of Scotland. As with all languages, Gaelic provides a perceptual grid or cognitive map of reality, influencing the social behaviour of its speakers and the social institutions of its speech community. This is evidenced by the place names which reflect the traditional activities of the Crofting community. For example, Cladach, the seashore, or Macha, the sandy coastal marges and duneland. There are many, 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 many more, and these all find their way into place names. As Robert Macfarlane has said, to speak out a run of these names is to create a story of travel. An act of naming is also an act of wayfinding. When looking at a map, Alistair McHeechan of North Uist told me how he knew 20 different names for different headlands, rocks, hillocks, points and bays and all the rest of it. He says these are not recorded on any map and come down to local tradition. He learnt these names from his father, whose local knowledge was recorded and is in the archive at the School of Scottish Studies in Edinburgh, but he's probably the only person who knows those names now. These place names are nodes or mental images for a cognitive map shared by the Gaelic-speaking Hebridean Islander. Scottish poet and novelist Ian Crichton Smith describes the centrality of Gaelic to Hebridean culture and place. I quote, "Those who do not share the language cannot imagine or share the imaginary landscape, the meeting of past or present in Gaelic place names of their islands. So often people talk to me about events that happened to their family over a century ago, as if they were events that had happened in the previous year or even the previous day. And these historical events seem to be equally important to them as the recent past." Katrina McCuish, talking about the place names that mean a river of blood, the site of a clearance after a hard and bloody battle between crofters and landowners and their agents to make way for sheep, says, "All the women had to fight with were clods of earth and stones, and of course there was a baton charge and they got their heads bashed in, and well, that little stream is called the River of Blood. Everybody on the island knows that place as the River of Blood, and when they say it in Gaelic, they are referring both to the place and to everything that's happened there through time." So long ago, linguistic anthropologist Sapir identified the unique reality shared by language groups. Language is a guide to social reality. The real world is to a large extent and consciously built on the language habits of the group. No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached. Traditionally, crofters had no security of tenure, and the precarity of their situation is demonstrated by the history of emigration from the islands. In the past, this was caused by a mixture of famine and poverty, and successive land clearances, often after hard and bloody fought battles between crofters and landowners. I'm really sorry, I'm repeating myself there. Sorry, I apologise. Let me move on. So, landscape architect Annie Sprin says that landscape may be inhabited in the imagination. Oh. We're not going to have any sound now then.
This happens here.
Okay. Okay. Landscape may be inhabited in the imagination and suggests that mental maps of a web of family performances in a landscape stretch back over time and are closely associated with the place. One of the ways that these are enshrined acoustically is through naming. Because of the way that land was used and traversed, and the fact that the coastline and moorland interiors are rough and rugged and full of potential danger, it made it necessary to name every little geographical feature. As the population of the Outer Hebrides decreases, and as more English-speaking incomers settle in the islands, there's a real sense of the importance of Gaelic and the preservation of traditional culture. While many place names are mapped, some are not, as we have seen, and one of the traditional ways that the community passed down the knowledge of the place names was orally, through the medium of Gaelic, but also through the tradition of the Ceili. The power's off, isn't it now?
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
It will come.
Okay, so I was going to play a song, but we'll come back to it maybe. In the past, before television and the internet, okay, it's on now. In the past, before television and the internet, the most characteristic form of recreation was to meet in the Ceili house in the evening, to pass the time in talk, storytelling and song. It has been observed that so much did song pervade the life in the township, it appears to have been as essential as eating and sleeping. In older times, the Ceili was more important than just a gathering of neighbours to talk over local problems and to discuss the import of whatever national news might have filtered through to the township via an itinerant packman or tinker. It was also an occasion where memories were revived and when the lineage of the folk of the town was restated. when the bards and singers were given a chance to freshen up old songs and poetry with yet another airing, and when the young were gradually made aware of their responsibilities to their family and to the community at large, not least when the older folk of the township were taken into the heart of the communal spirit, as was manifested by the ceilidh. Thus the ceilidh had a definite social function in the crofting township, and was not the occasion for pure entertainment, as it is today. So the ceilidh helped to foster the intense sense of community expressed by many of my subjects. As somebody tells me, there were good ceilidhs in houses, and there were pipers in Balashare, 4 in one family, 4 good pipers. You could go into any house without knocking. It was also a conduit for the transmission of culture, history and social behaviour, a place of speaking, singing and of listening, and a place for a continued, remembered recreation of past stories. This, along with the place names, act as a mnemonic for dynamic memory recreation, which meshes the lived landscape. So religion is still a significant factor in the life of the inhabitants of the Outer Hebrides. While the southern islands of Benbecula, South Uist and Barra are predominantly Roman Catholic, in the northern islands, particularly Harris and Lewis, the nonconformist conservative Free Church of Scotland and the still more conservative Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland, sometimes known colloquially as the Wee Frees, are very influential. Services are predominantly held in Gaelic, and unaccompanied psalm singing is a significant part of this. There's also a tradition of Sabbath observance, which, in case you don't know, means that nobody can do anything on the Sabbath. And recently, until very recently, or even now, if people are seen doing something like putting their washing out on a Sunday, then that's very frowned upon. Few shops or transport services are available on a Sunday, although this is increasingly contested. This gives the streets of Stornoway, the capital of the Outer Hebrides, a distinctive soundscape, which you hopefully heard in that last bit, with no background of traffic except cars which have pulled up to deliver people to church, the footsteps of people dressed up in their smart shoes and Sunday best, and the slamming of car doors are all that can be heard against a backdrop of the wind in the trees. Once inside, the sounds of the congregation are carried on the wind through the silent streets. So, I want to sort of end there really. I haven't got an argument to make at all, just a proposition. And the proposition is this, that what makes a place, or what makes people, what makes an atmosphere, or what makes is a whole series of vibrations that underplay everything and that have a sort of mesh or a kind of a web that reaches out across many, many, many different modes or nodes or many, many other things that that can kind of go under and over, and sometimes you're aware of them and sometimes you aren't aware of them. But in this particular case, and if you like, in this particular case study, there are certain things that can be identified that represent, if you like, maybe represent or maybe are a kind of audible representation of some of the surfacing, if you like, of some of those vibrations. Thank you. Sorry about the sound.
Yeah, thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much. I'm glad you brought up the religious little ethnographic note on the religious practices at the end, because my question is with regards to the place names. Can you tell us more what these consist of? Are those geographical words? Do they have maybe religious names attached to it? Place names, I'm very curious, right? What are the meaning, the semantic spectrum they draw on?
It's really interesting you said that, because it was like my perfect question. Thank you so much. Because the most recent project that I did there, right, the one I did with the museum and the Gaelic school children, was about place names. It was precisely about that. And it was about whose history is allowed to be sort of enshrined through the place names of a landscape. And I'm not a Gaelic speaker. That's the first thing. So obviously I'm working in a very difficult situation, though working with the museum and the historical societies and the school gave me a huge advantage into Gaelic. So what actually happened there was that I worked with the children, and they interviewed a lot of older people. They interviewed their grandparents, their parents, about specific places and about specific place names. And then we also all went and talked to the historical societies about those place names. And in fact, it turned out to be an enormous mixture of different things. Yeah. Virtually nothing religious. Right. Except unless you go back really a long way. I mean, some of the places were kind of things like probably sort of coming from a kind of Celtic Christianity, which is probably at least 1,000 years old. A lot of the place names were very, very descriptive, like, you know, the big hillock, or the little bay with lots of seaweed, or the place where the current goes that way, that kind of thing, which were very much a kind of navigatory system. And then a lot of them were sort of historical events, primarily to do with times of trauma. Oh, interesting. So the River of Blood, right, these kind of things. And just to sort of end that, what we did with the kids was that we renamed it all according to their memories of the landscape. So, and they all made really beautiful maps, and it was all really great. And the places were all ended up being called things like Sandy Jaffas, which was after where one of the kids had dropped his biscuits and had picked them up and they were all sandy. So, in the end, those names seem just as important, you know, as some of these kind of very weighty historical names.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Question. I was speaking to Alistair Roberts about psalm singing,
Mm.
which saying how wonderful it is.
It's amazing.
Extraordinary. And he was saying that there was a bit of a punk reaction among teenagers who were sick of sitting on hard pews in this
Oh, yeah.
conservative atmosphere. So I wondered if you'd come across any of that, or is that something that teenagers move to the cities and they don't, that counter movement of sound doesn't stay on the island?
Is that a question about sort of people leaving, or is it a question about whether they continue any sort of religious connection when they leave? Or
It's not
neither?
really about the religion, it's
about
the musical reaction
Right.
to a particular atmosphere,
Mm.
I suppose. I don't know, I don't know enough about it to know whether it's a reaction against religion or,
yeah,
the conservatism of it or,
Yeah.
or what. But it's not really a question about them leaving, it's about a clash of musical cultures. I
Right.
suppose.
I mean, in terms of musical culture, the musical culture is incredible there, as you know, and a huge proportion of children learn an instrument and play an instrument, and there are big competitions, and if you're a piper, you are sort of a bit of a rock star anyway. Even if and there are rock star pipers and punk pipers, but that it's not seen as a sort of nerdy, horrible thing like it might be in the rest of the UK. It's actually seen as something that people really want to do. If I were following my argument through, which I'm going to try, about vibrations, I would say that if you grow up surrounded by those sounds, you're never going to be able to totally rid yourself of them. They will be with you forever, whether you want them to be or not.
Yeah.
And I very much doubt whether, one of the things for people that don't know that is like any sort of urban place. If you're a teenager, education is seen as your way out. Or any place that's sort of isolated or rural or in a difficult position. Education is seen as the way out, and young people do leave the island. A lot of them then come back when they have kids. But I would say that it probably doesn't generally kind of go with any musical output they might have after that, but it must accompany their life forever in some way.
Yeah. Can I ask you another question? Presumably you play the pieces you make back to the people.
Yeah. Yes.
And
very varied.
and the rest of the world.
Yes. Yes. I mean, the exhibition that I had in the museum there, everybody that I've ever interviewed or talked to or said hello to ended up coming to that. And I'm not really sure. Well, they're really the whole range of reactions, yes. Including downright rude.
Can I ask a question about coming back to this to the music and the plays?
Yeah.
Was this kind of folk tune that you were playing, or that was part of
the tweed one or which bit?
Well, I think there was one with the accordion.
Oh, the accordion. Oh no, that was actually somebody's birthday party, and that was a traditional Scottish accordion folk tune. Yeah. Of the sort.
So I wonder how representative it was of that specific place, and that has to do with just throw in another speed, because I think traditional Scottish folk music is much more up tempo than this one that you played.
Do you?
Yeah.
Well, most Scottish folk music played on the accordion is made for dancing. And so it will be slow and fast. It'll have all tempos. But in general, you're sort of right. When I was going to play something that was going to illustrate sort of Kaylee, and it was at a cracking pace, but it wouldn't work. So, but however, that is being played. That particular recording was made from half a mile away. That was being played on a beach. I don't think anyone was dancing. They were probably just drinking and chatting. They probably wouldn't have been dancing anyway because it was pitch dark and they were on a very uneven bit of ground. I don't think it's true that everything is really fast.
No, not everything. I also have ballads.
Yes.
This particular struck me because it was at such a slow tempo, especially for, let's say, a rhythm that seemed to be like meant for dancing. So I wonder if there was a relation between the speed of music and the kind of remoteness of the place.
No, I'm not a musicologist, but I've been to a lot of Kayleys on the islands, and I can tell you they're as fast as anywhere else. I think that was just either a particular thing of the situation, the player. It might. I mean, for all I know, I never saw who was playing. It could be a 6-year-old boy. I don't know.
As part of your work, which I think is very interesting, and I like that you briefly told the story about working with kids and renaming these spaces. I'm wondering about that engagement with these locales, and in this case the Hebrides. I'm wondering, for example, do you workshop with the communities in terms of maybe teaching or talking a little bit about recording technologies and some of the methodologies that you use? And part of the reason I'm asking that is I'm thinking it might make sense in relationship to a culture that's relied heavily on orality historically, and maybe that might be an interesting way. Or is that culture already present within the
Oh, it's really present. I mean,
okay.
I mean, people have been making since they're really very famous folk song collectors that and oral history collectors that have been to the Hebrides, you know, including the one whose name I can't remember, Alan Lomax. Thank you very much. Even Alan Lomax has been there. And I would say that people are very, very, very conscious of their heritage and very, as a result, incredibly generous. Obviously, you know, there are all sorts of collection and recording initiatives going on there that are coming from the people there. It's not all people coming in at all, but it's a real big mixture of everything. I think they're very, very in control of their kind of heritage identity. Any other questions? Great. Thank you very much.
I am the chair of this session, made the chair of this session, of this last session of this wonderful, inspiring conference so far. And it's not the last session because there will be more music sessions coming. So it's my privilege to introduce Ali Jabbar. He studied at Kingston University London and received a Master in Art and Film Studies. His research area he's focusing on star studies, mainly looking closely at the ways in which audiences simultaneously construct and consume a particular star's persona. In his research, he has also located a prototype of the star personality in the dandies and aesthete literary figures of the 19th century, such as Beau Brummel and Oscar Wilde, comparing them with the likes of Omar Sharif and Cary Grant. Ali currently teaches at the School of Fashion and School of Film at Alba, and he also has lots of suits and ties.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Buddha, for You wanted me to thank you? That's why you were upset? Okay, thank you, Buddha. And this is my first endeavor into the domain of music and sound. I have no idea usually what I'm doing. And this paper was written for last year's seminar at Goldsmith in London, University of London. And upon the request of Buddha, I have to update the paper and submit it, because I think it's the only paper here dealing with the locality of Beirut and sound. So it mostly revolves around a criminally understudied scene in Beirut, which took place, or war metal scene, or black metal scene in Beirut that took place between that interval between 1990 and the end of the Civil War and 2006 with the Israeli or the Lebanese-Israeli war, and focuses precisely on the West Beirut metal scene, or mostly this is the West Beirut, this area, and a bit putting it face to face with the East Beirut metal scene. And so West Beirut, or West Beirut metal scene took place, or was its house was Hamra, or this town of Hamra. And so I discuss mainly one band who was the most prominent of all of this small metal scene, who we used to call Damar, which means destruction. And I'm going to discuss them in terms of locality, transnational connections, and of course, drawing on arguments concerning scenes and translocal scenes, but also discussing how their location or locality influenced them in their consumption and production of the metal music. Just a second. Okay? So it's called Sacrilege in Beirut, Translocal Connections, Musical Meaning, and Lo-Fi Aesthetics and the War Metal Sounds of Damar. Okay, so the paradox of Damar's case is that their career, encompassing the only release by the band, the demo Triumph Through Spears of Sacrilege, released in 2007, took place entirely in Lebanon, where their only record was not produced by a Lebanese label in a local studio. It was not made for a Lebanese record company. However, they produced music that made no attempt to musically or lyrically signify Lebanese-ness, released by a foreign label, and their music was consciously modeled on non-Lebanese bands and sung mostly in incomprehensive English. Damar's career can be understood as a trajectory through the extreme black metal scene, or black war metal scene. I use scene as my central unit of analysis and draw on two sets of sources. The first is the academic use of the concept scene, closely related to subculture, a key concept in the development of popular music studies, the shortcomings of which have been thoroughly discussed and are by now well known. Subculture connotes a tight-knit, rigidly bounded, implacably resistant, male-dominant, place-specific social space, if such formations ever did exist. The concept clashes with contemporary concerns about globalization, the ambiguities of resistance, and the heterogeneity of identity. Scene, on the other hand, connotes a more flexible, loose kind of space within which music is produced, a kind of context for musical practice. It assumes less about the homogeneity and coherence of its constituent activities and members. My use of scene also draws on everyday uses of the concept. The most common use of it is to refer to local, face-to-face context of music making and consumption. Of course, as an example, the Ross Bay war metal scene in Canada, or the Gothenburg death metal scene. This is similar to academic definitions of scene. The extreme metal scene connotes a decentralized, global, and diffuse network of producers and consumers of extreme metal. The concept of scene, therefore, allows us to define a unit of analysis that is emergent both from everyday reflexivity and from a more systematically theorized academic space. War black metal is a subgenre located under the umbrella of extreme black metal. The extreme metal scene emerged in the 1980s out of an interconnected musical and institutional rejection of heavy metal. During the 1980s, heavy metal became one of the most successful popular music genres, dominated by a relatively small number of European and American bands. Under the influence of punk, early 1980s bands such as Venom and Sepultura began to develop more radicalized forms of metal. These forms, including thrash, death, and black metal, eschewed melody and clear singing in favor of speed, down-tuned guitars, and growled or screamed vocals. Whilst each style has distinctive features and distinct networks of fans and musicians, They share enough to be frequently referred to by fans and musicians as extreme metal. Extreme metal began to be circulated through letter writings, tape trading, recordings on small labels and fanzines. From a very early stage, the underground, as the scene was often referred to, whether globally or in Beirut, was always highly decentralized. Many of its participants never met anybody from it face to face, and it was never reliant on local scenes. It was overly reliant on local scenes. Moreover, bands from countries outside of the traditional Anglo-American core of the recording industry were influential in its development, including countries as diverse as Brazil, Canada, Singapore, and of course, Lebanon. So war metal is notorious for being the extremist form of metal, and developed by Canadian grindcore proto-black metal band Blasphemy in Canada, maybe mid-80s. The style is a variation of black metal and consists of a musical fusion of elements borrowed from death thrash and grindcore, and draws on themes of war, misanthropy, genocide, and totalitarianism. Its typical musical traits are fast tempo and down-tuned power chords, lo-fi garage recordings, as the members of the scene refer to it. It also features abrupt and unpredictable guitar solos, more in the style of the first wave black metal, rather than the melodic solos of the Norwegian second wave. The tempo of war metal songs is also markedly increased, often punctuated with abrupt, grindcore-like bursts of speed. Grindcore is like a punkoid kind of speed, reducing the song's length to about 3 minutes or less. Also, whereas black metal is noted for its ghostly shrieks, war metal vocalists growl in a much lower register, akin to death metal. So while central global scenes dominated the production of more popular metal forms, for example, heavy metal, more extreme forms of metal are produced, consumed, and discussed within highly decentralized global network of cultural production, according to Ken Harris. As one of its most underground variations, war metal is considerably less globally popular than other forms of metal, say thrash or black metal. And globally dispersed, local scenes play an unusually important role in developing and expanding it. From this perspective, those local scenes are never just markets for the products of the stronger ones, but are vital contributors, and the musical production within the style is a mixture of local and global streams of influence. Of course, this diversity is enabled by the fact that war metal, generally speaking, does not draw on white nationalist aesthetics or beliefs familiar or popular in black metal. While war metal bands refute racism, evident in the fact that vital contributors to the scene are bands from countries like Brazil or Singapore, black metal, on the other hand, is seen as a site of construction of whiteness and white identity that has been utilized in an explicitly racist way in what is usually known as national socialist black metal, where crass racism, fascism, anti-Semitism is ripe. Thus, the cynic infrastructure, according to Ken Harris, of war metal is a multicultural arena tailor-made for diversified ethnicities and diasporic localities to participate and play a vital part in the bigger global scene. Damar did contribute to that trajectory. The band's musical material did not only aid the reproduction and maintenance of the style, but also opened a cross-cultural exchange between translocal scenes. Okay, so local scenes have been particularly important in pioneering new styles that have been gone into to be popular throughout the global scene. For example, in the 1980s, the San Francisco Bay Area scene was crucial in the development of thrash metal. Damar's music, however, is not representative of a uniquely Lebanese extreme metal style, but the crude form of black death metal has strong similarities to early war metal incarnations such as Blasphemy and Revenge. Both are from Canada. So it would be easy to conclude that in their music, Damar simply copied more prominent war metal bands from elsewhere in the world. However, from a very early stage, Damar were not only connected to the global scene, but also contributed to it. One band member reports that early recordings were circulated worldwide by other scene members via fanzines and tapes. Damar should rather be seen as one of the many bands from throughout the world involved in the decentralized process through which the emerging genre of war metal was birthed out of black metal. Yet neither should we conclude that Damar's location in Beirut was insignificant. Indeed, if there was a reason behind Damar's status as a cult band in the global war metal scene, it is because of their geographic, place-specific sounds. Certainly, the Lebanese scene from which Damar emerged never popularized a particular style in a way more famous local scenes did. But it did have its unique characteristics. For one thing, the early Lebanese metal scene was not only marginal to the global extreme metal scene, but Western style rock in general was at that stage in a non-hegemonic position in the country as a whole. Indeed, the scene was largely confined to eastern side of Beirut, Burj Hammoud and Ashrafiyya. Damar, however, were located in western side of Beirut. And the band interacted closely with the emerging heavy metal and punk scenes in Hamra at the time, bands like Night Chains or Benzine. The unique Lebanese praxis that the band helped to fashion was different from other local praxis worldwide. It is crucial then to discuss the significance of location in the construction of Beirut's metal music. Lebanon's geographical location, complicated political history, and its social construction influenced how local scenes were constructed and the ways metal was consumed and produced. The Lebanese metal scene prior to 2003 was mainly congested in Beirut's predominantly Christian eastern part, which was economically more accomplished and politically more stable, and had cultural accessibility to Western produced music than its Western counterpart. Mainstream forms of metal were accessible and popularized due to the rise of phenomena of music stores and music venues. Places like Discorama, Music City, and Cherries, where they were venues harboring or producing metal, or selling metal merchandise. And immigration to France by many Christian families during the Civil War years opened for cultural accessibility to mainstream metal or music in general, which was brought back to Lebanon and infused with folkloric instruments. East Beirut's hegemonic metal styles became eroded with the development of doom and black metal. However, as it was becoming common during the 1990s to produce music that attended to place, cultural origin, and nationhood. An important factor in this was the rise of black metal from around 1992-93, in which Scandinavian bands constructed powerful myths and nationhood from ideas of pagan, Viking, anti-Christian ancestry. Some of these bands incorporated folk instruments and styles into their music and drew on Western classical music in order to construct a more authentic sound. This led to a discourse that often crossed into overt racism. The metal scene in East Beirut followed suit, and mostly produced music attended to place, cultural origin, and nationhood, drawing on local instrumentation and constructed to place in various ways. Generally speaking, the metal produced in East Beirut was mainly Gothic and progressive folk metal, or hybridized forms of metal that fused Oriental musical instruments such as oud, buzuk, and qanun with traditional melodic metal instruments such as keyboards and synthesizers, creating mostly utopian-leaning syncretic forms of music expressions that celebrated themes of nationhood, mythology, and nostalgia. And of course, they were mostly influenced by Israeli Oriental black metal band Orphaned Land. And Damar also contributed to this trajectory, albeit differently, as I will argue later. So on the western side of Beirut, however, lack of prosperity was highly significant, or compared to the eastern side of Beirut, with the band coming from struggling lower middle-class families, or Muslim middle-class families. The Beirut scene in general, and West Beirut scene in particular, whilst having its own embryonic institutions, was thus extremely limited in scope in the late 1990s and early 2000s, with only few shops catering for metal and no record labels whatsoever. So Mark Olson argues that scenes are territorializing machines that produce particular kinds of relationship to geographic location. Damar's location was productive of and produced by a certain kind of relationship between global and local scenes. Both scenes were quasi-autonomous from each other in that they were dependent on each other, yet contained practices, texts, institutions, and forms of capital that were unique to each. This meant that Damar interacted simultaneously within the Lebanese scene and the global scene. More crucially, however, Damar's origin and location was also crucial in the formation of their war metal tones and themes, which were markedly different than the metal produced by the eastern counterpart. Indeed, the West Beirut metal scene was congested in the town of Hamra and Ras Beirut area. Also, there was no representative music venues to host events or to establish constant interaction between the different local scenes. Moreover, two of Damar's members come from Shia Muslim lower-class families and lived in Dahi, or Beirut's southern suburbia, Hezbollah's stronghold. So there was a sense of displacement due to the incapability of being musically active in a Muslim society, especially with the kind of music that rejects religious institutions and extremism. And as consequences, the band was self-emplaced in Hamra. Also, Damar's demo was released in 2007, less than a year after the end of the Israeli war on Lebanon. And of course, at that time, Lebanon was going through a political turmoil post-war, post-2006, following the assassination of Prime Minister Sarfik Hariri, which was followed by the Israeli war on Lebanon, of course, which left the country in a state of rebuilding, a war-torn landscape infested in the ambient noise of post-war traffic, electric motors, and construction. So the band took base in the Pavilion Hotel in Hamra, which is 5 minutes away, an iconic structure that had its own historic and political specificities, and opened the first metal venue in West Beirut known as the Local, becoming the home to the West, or of the West Beirut scene. The Local was sandwiched between a whorehouse and a club in the hotel and was one of the two structures. The other would be Jeffinor, that survived the civil war unscathed. During the war, the owner constantly bribed the fighting factions fighting around the province of Hamra so that the hotel won't be targeted. Throughout the war years, the hotel became the home of vagabonds, drug dealers, intelligentsia, Western and local pacifists. It became a physical incarnation of what Homi Bhabha would call third space, a site of negotiation where different alternative subversive meanings emerge. The hotel became an erect space for counter-hegemonic practices of disempowered groups, I quote. In 2005, the hotel became the home of the new metal scene, of course, the Ras Bay collective, as they used to call it, which also included bands like Ayat, which means Quranic verses in Arabic, forming a quasi-community at the locale. Okay, so my use of the term third space depends heavily on the scholarship of Homi Bhabha, understanding of cultural processes and performances as what political theorist Harry Boyd calls free space. A post-colonial theorist, Bhabha's work excavates the underlying meaning contained in seemingly simple moments. His conception of third space acknowledges that while Western cultures often polarize identities and structures, such as boys, girls, men, women, work, play, productive and questioning engagement with dialectical identities and boundaries can create gaps between or ruptures. This between calls into question fixed categorizations of things as this or that, and fosters new possibilities for cultural meanings. Bhabha's work is not concerned with revolution nor with ideological evolution, both of which were still contained on the line between thesis and antithesis, but rather expanding creative possibilities and cultural mashups. Bhabha's third space adds the third dimension to the limited possibilities of polarized understandings and moves us off the page and into space. So the feasibility of applying the Bhabhian notion of hybridity, third space, and negotiation to the practice and theory of Damar's music seem obvious, and how such musical acts form spaces outside the conventional boundaries of identity and community. Bhabha's third space is key to understanding an intercultural musical group such as Damar operating in Beirut. While third space is essentially theoretical space rather than actual space, and thus is often used by ethnomusicologists to refer to sound product, I use the term third space to refer to the actual physical performance space, which I argue cannot be divorced from the musical expression of subculture, unconventional, multiple, and or deviant identities. Performances occurring within third spaces, venues of third space venues, can be argued to be viewed as the physical embodiment of Bhabha's third space. These spaces, like the Pavilion Hotel, can be understood as an in-between environment, constituting liminal temporal moments and spatial movements, as well as liminal ideological displays. Performance in such a space is instrumental in facilitating intercultural encounters of inimical identities, often united both through social protest and commentary, evident in lyrics and live performances. Practically speaking, this third space is constructed in two ways. One, through performance and interactions in the locale of the pavilion and everyday interactions in it. Secondly, through performance, explicit and implicit negotiations of music, performance, space, stereotypes, and markers of identity. And here I'm referring to their musical gigs and their mashups or their performance of community. Of course, this all falls in line with what Harry Boyd writes in his book, Everyday Politics, Reconnecting Citizens and Public Life. Free space, rooted in everyday life settings, are places in which powerless people have a measure of autonomy for self-organization and engagement with alternative ideas. As a society, class or sect standardizes life. Look at those nice chaps. And youth's lives is standardized and is not allowed to a political voice. They have no say in the way space is designed or regulated from a socio-political level. Boyle points out, I quote, free spaces are culturally creating spaces where people generate new ways of looking and engaging with the world. In free spaces, people simultaneously draw upon and rework symbols, ideas, themes, and values in their traditions and culture to challenge conventional beliefs. So perhaps I'm gonna just play something. Here are, this is Damar actually, one of the photos standing next to a destroyed building in downtown Beirut. Of course, they're very good looking young men. Just to play it, so this is Blasphemy, or the photo of Blasphemy, the band who originated, started the whole war metal music. I'm gonna play just a part for you just to have an idea of what the genre sounds like. As you can see, it's a bunch of indecipherable noise and heavy guitars and vocals. So the band's lo-fi, noise-infested sounds was an other, enacting a third space beyond the confines of the geographic here and now, against the modes of sanitization predominantly existing in East Beirut metal music. Beyond the hegemonic hi-fi metal sounds of Beirut, a number of scholars have pointed to the ways certain forms of music play a role in generating new spaces of emancipation, where the music itself functions as an actual place to go to. Daniel Fishlin have called it the other side of nowhere, while for Mark Anthony Neal, it is making a way out of nowhere, a sort of social improvised space. Neal's emphasis on the creation of space and place through music does not stop with the music, but involves the physical construction of space as well. Musical formation that becomes social formation. To borrow from Althusser, enacting what Paul Gilroy has called the contemporary politics of transfiguration, which exists on a lower frequency where it is played, danced and acted, as well as sung and sung about. For the musical members of Damar, the pavilion hotel as a space was where musical expression became social formation, where the pavilion was an actualized musical somewhere brought into being through the lower frequencies of war metal. Here, of course, we should draw an analytical distinction between, this is before I just go into analyzing Damar's music or playing some parts. However, I'd like to play some of the other forms of metal bands that were emerging as well in the western side of Beirut. One of them would be Ayat, so here. The first photo, and the second one would be Night Chains. They were also heavy metal, Lebanese heavy metal band. It's interesting how they both relate, and while music or metal music being produced in Eastern Beirut was more about myth or nationhood or nostalgia, those people were mostly integrating or constructing a certain way of looking at the war. And whilst in East Beirut, it was not really the case. It was never really dealt with, as if the idea was oppressed altogether. So this, the song I'm going to play actually starts with a woman crying after the massacre of Qana in 1996. Second would be Night Chains, which was one of the earlier heavy metal bands in West Beirut.
See that down there? Yeah, that's Beirut. And a nice day. You don't do that. Just wait I'll come just 15. One of
Okay, and this is a photo, the only photo, existing photo of Damar. Of course, adapting all the paraphernalia of war black metal aesthetics. Anyway, so Damar's demo consists of an intro and 4 songs, one of which is a cover of Blasphemy's Desecration. The aesthetics of the EP signify... okay, maybe I should play... sorry, this one. Okay, so aesthetics of the EP signify location while remaining faithful to the genre style. The lo-fi grainy quality of the demo's cover draws prodigally on black metal iconography. The band's name is written in Arabic and mimics in design the traditional black metal style of dissolving branches. The title echoes the classical typography associated with the genre, whereas the image used was taken from a Lebanese Civil War photo archive of a miniature bullet-infested statue of Mary, as if the photo was taken from the eastern side of Beirut on looking a destroyed Masarif Street. And this was the actual front line between the east side and the west side, between the Muslim side and the Christian side during the Civil War. The lyrical themes explicitly attend to place and draw on religious and political oppression, according to one of the band's members. The lyrics are written in English, and only the second part of Reaching for Mass Suicide is sung in Arabic, albeit being undecipherable. The band's general reliance on English does not necessarily reflect their refusal to engage with their local lingo, but writing Arabic lyrics is a harder task, whereas English remains more accessible to the bigger global scenes. Okay, so I'm gonna play the intro of the demo, which I find really interesting, and then we're gonna discuss it, and the second song, which is Preaching from a Suicide. Okay. So the EP opens with an intro fusl, which means sacrilege in Arabic. That runs the audio recording of the 2004 Al-Qaeda beheading of alleged Egyptian spy Muhammad Mutwalli. The voice of the Imam claiming the law of the sword on the Egyptian spy is embossed by verses of the Quran. Mutwalli's cries dissolve into the highly distorted inhuman screams of the vocalist before it gives way to a hellish chaos that comes to an end with a simulated explosion, before the brutal onslaught of Preaching from a Suicide commences. So we're going to play Preaching from just a part of it. So the song starts at full force with drums blasting and guitars shredding loudly, creating a caustic and unforgiving wall of noise coupled with the unintelligible screams of the vocalist. They underline the oppressive feeling. The music slows down shortly, then comes back again at full brutalizing speed, in a manner that illustrates the level of control, even in chaos, but also creates moments of rising above despite everything. And the guitars have a really thick and crushing feeling courtesy of their low tuning and high distortion. However, as usual on many war metal records, the faster parts of the songs usually relegate the guitars into a secondary position in order to continue building the constant wall of noise. In contrast to the hegemonic metal sounds produced in East Beirut, Triumph refracts the concerns of the global musical scene through a lens of particular construction of Lebaneseness. The local topics dwelt upon are not tokenistic incorporations of an exotic other to prop up a moribund music, but a brutal resource to be learned from that is part of Damar, who are also part of a wider global scene. Timbral brutality in war metal is always aligned with the perception of noise, from extreme loudness to inhuman vocal and guitar distortions, both of which imply a determined breaching of boundaries. Lo-fi noise, according to Khan Harris, is the operative experiential gestalt when assessing black metal timbre. The anti-code that goes up against the normal acceptable code of music, part of the identification with noise, as several theorists have noted, is at its heart sociological. Scene members value harsh sound qualities because it garners extreme antipathy by the general populace. As Khan Harris observes, extreme forms of metal involve the aestheticization of sound that many people find repellent, and I quote, while such repellent sound qualities grant subcultures a scene of distinction and cohesion, noise does not only demarcates the other and builds bridges within its in-group, it also serves a crucial function within music itself. The symbolic poles of chaos and control, according to Khan Harris, are central to extreme metal, and noise is the primary acoustic ingredient in the representation of chaos. Metal isn't meant to sound pretty, even to fans. Metal's deliberately transgressive, noisy, violent side, as Wallster notes, is not actually given free rein. Rather, chaotic elements, such as noise, are summoned only to be restrained and brought under meticulous control, or transformed into music. In this sense, scene members are familiar with hearing the duality interplay of noise and music. Metal is not an unredeemable noise, but to listeners it is ordered chaos, a constant relationship between the binaries chaos and control. Murray Schafer makes a clear distinction between two types of soundscapes: the acoustically polluted lo-fi of our contemporary world, and the clear hearing that is hi-fi. One of the main theses of his book, The Tuning of the World, published in 1977, is that soundscape is not an accidental byproduct of society, but on the contrary, it is construction, a more or less conscious composition of the acoustic environment we live in. Murray calls for a subjective effort to pursue and progressively refine what he calls an ear cleaning process, which means to become able to listen to and evaluate the sounds and surroundings of the surrounding environments in an analytical way, a process which he favors compared to his more negative views on lo-fi, a chaotic soundscape that he finds confusing and symptom of decadence of society. Murray calls for an act of controlling the incoming ambience by means of acoustic design. The underlying intention is to transform the lo-fi sounds into hi-fi sounds, removing noise contents while prioritizing the potential entertainment and enjoyment of the audience members. However, if we intend to challenge the Schaeferian dialect, first he calls for a sense of control over the noise of the environment. He argues we are its composers and performers, responsible for giving it form and beauty, a form of utopian escapism if you want to apply it on the eastern side of the black metal produced on the eastern side of Beirut. Tuscan Harris would argue in extreme metal order and chaos is achieved, and in black metal music through noise is produced. Controlled noise here, under the guise of chaos, gives the scene members a sense of agency and control in their lo-fi chaotic soundscape environment by negotiating new ways of invoking, producing, and listening to music. Music's very presence can become a signifier of a newfound agency of control in a political situation that is out of their control. So the sounds of war reproduced in Damar's music are familiarly part of the sonic background and reality of what the band members and their families have experienced in their environment in 2006 and the Civil War before. For the members, the recurrent sounds of bombs and bullets are tied in with their memories and post-memories of the war. Because of the general soundscape of 2006 war was lo-fi, reflected the impossibility of a West Beirut metal music to cater to hi-fi, or music in general to cater to hi-fi. The band's quest to capture the ambience of the time and the sonic environment of modern war represents the bottom limits of lo-fi and outburst. The aberrational noise of war is an abject space that so assaults the world of natural sounds that it barely qualifies as a soundscape at all. The ideals of hi-fi could be argued to be intimately connected with the escapist effects of the post-war cultural complex that permits a virtual escape from the noise that haunts their present. That's it.
Any questions, comments? Just to wake you up.
Thank you.
Thanks for a good
Right.
paper. I was wondering if you could comment more on the kind of, so you're talking about like a third space and a subculture, kind of the boundaries and exclusions and kind of relations that exist within this scene. So I'm thinking of my own research in Egypt, like,
Right.
for, like this scene is a highly masculinized one. I mean,
That's what I didn't want to go
Yeah,
add,
yeah,
actually,
right.
because Benzine, the first punk band, and then later on Detox, the vocalists and prime members were women, actually.
Mhm.
It was in a way, sorry, you want to say something?
Well, so I just was, like, my question was, so even in the images you showed, it's kind of projecting like a certain type of masculinity
Right.
in those images. So if you could talk maybe a little bit more about not only just gender, but also maybe class and how that's working.
Right, of course. In a way, there was always between West and East Beirut, there was always this, between the Muslim side of Beirut and the Israel of Beirut, there was always this issue with class in a way, because from the Muslim point of view, not generally speaking, of course, a certain lower class in Muslim areas, they always looked at the Christian side of Beirut as where freedom was performed, or masculinity was at its best in a way, because masculinity in West Beirut was most challenged by lack of money, lack of prosperity, there was no agency. So in a way, there was always this class-injured performance in a way. So at least because I was part of that scene, how we looked at the eastern side was always with like they were better than us, you know, or they were freer than us, or they were harboring all the enjoyment that we didn't have access to, that per se. But and it's interesting in a way because their paraphernalia or boots or bullet belts, etc., in a way connotes a certain working class background. And especially it's not a coincidence that two of the members came from Shia backgrounds, and two of them became later on sheikhs in Najaf in Iraq. So from one extreme to another. So and their third brother died in fighting with Hezbollah, or he was martyred fighting against Israel. So there was this kind of weird dynamic in a way. I'm not sure if that answers your question per se.
Is there a kind of imaginary division or maybe it was real, east and west, geopolitically?
Right.
But do you think there was and is a possibility of kind of interpenetration or confluence between east and west? How does it manifest? Or somewhere else?
There were actually, later on, after 2012, there was a couple of bands emerging from, what you mean by interaction, but from both scenes in a way? Yeah, there were Coyotean and a couple of other grindcore bands. Coyotean was like a neo-war metal band, but they were based in Ashrafiyya in east side of Beirut. And they were collaborating with Ayat, which was Maz Zahruddin, which was the punkoid black metal. So yeah, some sort of, and their musical form was a bit distinctly weird or strange because they were actually very overly politicized. They even were over-politicized to the extent that they would, in their lyrics, discuss sectarian divisions, and that was not really that common at least in Damar's music or the black metal music in general. It was more about tackling themes of misanthropy or being anti-Islam or anti-Christianity. So in a way, yeah, there was this kind of interaction, but that's around 2012, 7 years after. 2007 with Damar, they disbanded, and then later on there were new forms of metal. And then the whole scene died out anyway. It just barely exists. It was replaced at one point by punk, and then later on by a small rockabilly scene. That was it.
Well, thank you very much. If there aren't any more comments, questions.
Thank you.
Then, another clap. Our first and last speaker is Udatio. He's an artist, researcher, writer, and theorist focusing on sound as his primary medium, and he's produced works for installation and live performance broadly dealing with contemporary issues such as the climatic crisis, human intervention in the environment, ecology, race and migration, and so on. He has a diploma in cinematic arts from India, a master's in media communication and cultural studies from Aarhus University, Denmark, and a PhD from Leiden University in artistic research and sound studies. He has had numerous fellowships, exhibition sites. He has displayed his work and had been on all kinds of sound festivals. But let me tell you a little bit about his publications. His PhD thesis is published with Leiden University Press called Audible Absence, Searching for the Site in Sound Production. But he has two forthcoming monographies, one with Bombay Gala Books entitled Between the Headphones, Sound Practice in the Cinema, and another forthcoming monograph with Paul Griffin Macmillan with the working title, am I allowed to read that?
Which one?
Beyond Immersion,
Oh yes.
Yeah? See,
Upcoming.
forthcoming, it's really forthcoming. Beyond immersion, entertaining through sound.
I'm
Should I
sorry.
say more? I can talk about you as long as you
Yeah,
use
better
time.
to stop there.
All right.
We don't have much time.
Yes.
We have to finish in 10 minutes because Mezian will be waiting. So I will make a very an abridged version of my paper, and luckily I cannot play my sound, so it's even shorter. And anyway, yeah, maybe I don't know why it's not working, but I usually take my classes here. Students are sitting in the same position, like in the chairs, and they can hear sounds I play from the same laptop. But today it's not working. Okay, it doesn't need to be played back right now because the same piece I'll be performing in its entirety tonight at Beirut Art Center. Eye contact with the city. So it's difficult to speak about sound, particularly sounds which are overwhelming. For example, in an Indian city, because often those experiences are overwhelming in the sense that kind of immersive listening experience. I'll read a little part of my paper, a brief version. The evolving vision of a re-emerging India from its post-colonial rubble has been one in which a majority of people will move from the countryside to settle in the cities. The potentially hyper-modernizing effects of an imminent urban life opens up debates about the status of the city's current atmosphere, ambience, and general appearance, particularly over the spatial dynamics that have contributed to a much larger set of concerns about India's urban planning since its much-deserved independence in 1947. Currently burgeoning between the rural hinterland and an emerging urban landscape, the contemporary design of Indian cities, however, undermines aesthetic choices by keeping its predominant interest in overwhelming growth and expansion. But at the same time, the spatial dynamics of these cities are severely affected by phenomena such as globalization, hybridization, digital convergence, and most importantly, decolonization, in which the historically old and the new are shifting contexts and meanings through constant interpenetration. In the present scenario of rampant and sporadic urban development, the active and intense interplay between tradition, a complex trajectory of its history, and the current trends of development under economic growth makes one's perception of a typical Indian city untidy and frenzied, as well as experientially overwhelming, as I already mentioned. Urban planners and theorists associate these intricate urban atmospheres with words and expressions such as unintended, continuously thwarted, inadequate, chaotic, and so forth, shedding some light on the urban physiognomy of the re-emerging Indian cities. Re-emerging, I'm using instead of emerging, re-emergence connotes to the past. I would not call glory, but kind of opulence of Indian cities, which many European explorers wanted to excavate during pre-colonial or colonial era. According to veteran urban planners, this disparity between the conceived scheme and the perceived appearance is largely due to the urban design being kept on the margin. This disparity also explains the generally syncretic, chaotic, and inchoate structure of Indian cities. The effect is evident in the general indisposition of the urban atmosphere, particularly in the composite character of the everyday ambience, with multiple layers of sound from pre-industrial and pre-colonial eras, coalesce with sounds in the post-colonial, or more precisely contemporary decolonial era. Drawing on the writings of Althusser and Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, one can argue that historical evolution of a place, its social fabric, and its atmosphere may not necessarily be a linear one, but it is a multi-layered, multilinear, or plural process, which is open to multiple influences and peripheral interventions. From this perspective emerges the idea of social formation, which refers to a society, a social structure at any level, like an Indian city, with all its complexities, as it is historically constituted. So, in my work, I wanted to respond to this awareness that Indian cities, they carry a very complex history, including a recent history of colonial atrocities and pre-colonial opulence, and then the recuperation from the 200 years of colonial times, including, for example, the Bengal famine, 1877, Bengal famine 1943, where millions of people died. So the cities like Kolkata were covered in these colonial times. So also the partition, 1905 and 1948, cities like Kolkata were covered with screaming of the bodies in hunger and death, sounds which stood in stark contrast with the serene atmosphere of the sylvan landscape of Bengal we read in the pre-colonial literature and writings. These sonic drifts and the dichotomies hint at the processes of an auditory social formation at many of the Indian cities, such as Kolkata, Bangalore, and Mumbai. My work is based on recordings I made in Bangalore for many, many years. It is no wonder that the sound environment of a typical Indian city like Bangalore is multi-layered, with historically embedded sounds being simultaneously active in juxtaposition or in contrapuntal relationships, thus evolving in a spatio-temporal cacophony. Hence, it is sonically overwhelming and potentially disorienting for the listening subject. It might be argued that grasping the complex nature of a sound environment by relying on the immediately immersive listening to the everyday sounds could be considered a phenomenologically reductive exercise. Following this argument, the goal of the present investigation and the conceptualization of my work could be to discover if there is an appropriate method capable of producing a comprehensive understanding of the historical dynamics in any urban sonic atmosphere through sound art practice. So in this paper, I just mentioned, not described in its entirety because of time constraint, mentioned the sound work Elegy for Bangalore as part of the project Eye Contact with the City, produced through extensive fieldworks conducted in Bangalore, involving the artistic processes of contemplative listening, sonic drifting, and field recording. Field recording is being theorized in a number of presentations in this seminar and elsewhere. However, what I mean by contemplative listening and sonic drifting will be revealed in the following discussion and through the listening experience examples of the work. Murray Schafer and his soundscape theory, if we call in that way, his approach is non-inclusive in nature and unnecessarily burdened with the ethical ideas of urban pollution and sanitization. This is my argument. It is not only my argument, many other scholars have mentioned. They have expressed their problems of Schafer's ideas of soundscape. But what I maintain here is that it is important for a listening subject to hear the fuller spectrum of sounds and incorporate it into the subjective experience by adaptive perception. This is a coinage I use for the specific purpose of articulating an approach that suggests that sound pollution or an imbalance in the acoustic ecology of any given city can be considered as a lack of reciprocity, manifest in a need for playful design and aesthetic mediation between sound sources and the human ear, where the individuality and selfhood of the listener is considered important. I further argue in this paper that a necessary prerequisite for a comprehensive and inclusive understanding of the urban atmosphere, which is very complex in nature, would be the listener's contemplative detachment from the urban setting itself. This detachment will be able to gather knowledge about the historically constituted sonic character and the atmosphere. Given the specifically chaotic and disorganized nature of Indian cities currently, it is challenging for a city dweller to envisage the city before appreciating, in the light of psychogeography, the soft ambience, such as the sound environment, in order to mentally speculate on the hard ambiances, like the architectural outlines. We can think of a city as being a circular urban constellation with inner and outer peripheries. A contemplative and mindful listening would then involve a deterritorialized sound walking from the inner to the outer, delving into spatio-temporal experiences and conjuring up emergent sonic imageries by interacting with and reflecting upon the specific ambiances and the auditory situation. By listening and drifting this way through an unfamiliar site, or defamiliarized site by taking a contemplative distance, one may indulge in a mental journey as a psychogeographic exploration in an attempt to transform the urban experience for aesthetic purposes. One can take in and excavate a part of the acoustic geography as a nomadic listener rather than an everyday city dweller and insider. This deterritorialized and unsocial position of the listener helps to transform the perspectives of the unfamiliar city into something creatively fruitful and imaginative, which, according to Guy Debord, entails a playful constructive behavior. It was my contention in the project that finding an urban imaginary and speculating not only the hard ambiances, but also the historical constituents of the soft ambiances through sound and listening can be achieved by employing a mode of contemplative listening and exploring the specific artistic potential of psychogeography, where listening subject can be detached like an onlooker, outsider of the social margin, in other words, like an alien or a savage or a stranger. Since otherwise, in the mode of usually immersive listening in the city, the situated listener will lose the critical faculty of observation, failing to construe the historically constituted atmospheres. Here I would like to refer to the work of Levi-Strauss, namely The Savage Mind, which can be interpreted as an artistic position. Artists can indeed be seen as savages and the aliens in a society, or becoming unsocial. Such position endows them with critical eyes and ears, removed from the everyday grind. The primary methodology of examining the ambience of Bangalore in my work has therefore included the practice of psychogeography by playfully drifting through the sound environment as a nomadic listener, an experimental approach that is complemented by field recording to register these itinerant encounters, followed by studio work of composing and sound production. I applied this trajectory of artistic processes, following my lived experience and a personified sonic interaction with the shifting atmosphere of the city, which I could not have approached in a cartographic sense. Instead of mapping the immediately unfathomable and indiscernible city to demarcate its acoustic terrains, I prefer to act as what I am calling a sonic drifter or a nomadic listener, an auditory equivalent of enacting the derive in a psychogeographic practice. Thank you. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say something about the tension that I I'm perceiving between familiarity on the one side, so you're making field recordings in Bangalore, a city which you're obviously very familiar with. And on the other hand, you're advocating a kind of defamiliarization. So there's a kind of tension there. Can you say something about that? About a tension between familiarity on the one side, being very familiar with the place so that you know where to go and how to record and what to record, and on the other hand, this defamiliarization that takes place while recording it.
This is an artistic position or artistic strategy in my work, where I create this tension. Also in the listening experience, you might notice that that there is a tension between familiarity and defamiliarization. Also between abstraction and recognition, between presence and absence. And this strategy works well in the context of taking Indian cities as subjects or as sites for investigation. And this tension is something poetic in the sense that there's a constant conflict between presence, which are represented by the field recordings themselves, and the live process during the performance. So this interplay, I think, is very useful in my work.
And how is that for the recipient who is not familiar with the place, for example?
Right. Perhaps the mere documentary evidence of the field recording would not engage the listening subject, the audience. Perhaps this poetic presence in the composition or performance strategy produced by the performance strategy would be to engage more intensively, engage the audience more intensively. Perhaps this tension would engage the audience more intensively rather than mere documentation of the site. I think this is resonating with many other sound artists or field recording artists working in the field, and their work creates a tension in different levels.
Can I ask something about the methodologies, the coimas that have sonic drifting and melodic listener, which you practice while you're engaging with the sound? How much of that is still how you are creating, composing your work, and which is that will be tested for an audience who is not very familiar with the sites? How that process can be still as a compositional process rather than just an exploratory methodology?
Familiar representation through field recording would involve or will need the artist working as an interlocutor, right? As an interlocutor who is giving presentations of the sites he or she is recording, like Bangalore. I didn't want to, or I think many other sound artists don't want to play the role of an interlocutor, but rather a provocateur. So the provocation can be produced through this interplay between presence and absence, as I already mentioned. But mere interlocutor is not fun for a sound recordist or field recording artist to play, like a documentary approach. So field recording artists are not mere documentarians, I would argue.
I wanted to add something on your definition of a nomadic listener and about the practice of drifting. I was fascinated by, of course, the methodology, but also in the end you follow your interests in a way, and then you end up focusing on a specific issue of the city, for example. So actually you are unconsciously in a way following your interests and finally finding the precise, I don't know, spot or theme to further more and more. So what about this?
Well, in Bangalore, I didn't follow any cartographic mapping in the sense that I didn't plan beforehand. In the beginning of my residency, I spent 1 month lying on my balcony or on my flat, listening to the city, figuring out the different layers of the city emerging in front of my ears. And then I walked through the city, and by chance I encountered certain zones without knowing them that they existed, such as the construction sites in the metro, and then some flea markets where I found old discarded tapes and cassettes, and those cassettes became integral part of my composition, the sounds, particularly the room tones, and they are the recordings from 1940s and 50s, historical recordings of room tones, Bangalore, and they are the secondary layer apart from the immediate reality of construction sites, and also the medium-specific noise of those tapes. They are part of the narrative. So I didn't, to answer your question, I didn't actually plan to find some zones. Those zones found me by chance. And this contingency is something crucial for this project, or also many of my projects. The sense of contingency, chance, encounters.
They found you, but they found you because
You found that's what I want to
you came
stress.
near them, not just
Yes, yeah. You may remember, Maria, that we had a conversation for Sensing Cities, which was, I think, AIR or Resident FM. There I was discussing about contemplative listening as a method.
Which I also mentioned.
Right. Which might also respond to your question.
Yes, absolutely. I think we are all talking about the same thing. That was from a different angle. Just
So I think as an organizer of this seminar, I must say that no more questions, please, because we will take 10 minutes of walk, and the screening will be starting at 4:30, but it's already 4:30 here. So please, no more questions. I refuse to answer.